Mirtha Jung is best known as the ex-wife of Boston George Young, a prominent figure in the drug smuggling trade during the 1970s and 1980s. Their life story gained attention after being portrayed in the 2001 movie Blow, where Mirtha was played by Penelope Cruz. Mirtha's story is an amazing journey of a woman dealing with the highs and lows that come with the cocaine trade. From a drug queen pin to a single mother dealing with addiction and depression. Health Wealth Diary brings to you the incredible true story of the real wife from the movie Blow. This is the Mirtha Jung story. Mirtha Calderon, better known as Mirtha Jung, was born in Cuba in the early 1950s. Raised in a time of political unrest and economic struggle, Mirtha grew up in a world that demanded resilience. Her early years were shaped by the Cuban Revolution and its aftermath, a period of immense change that left many young people disillusioned and searching for opportunity elsewhere. Mirtha was a curious and ambitious girl, but her surroundings offered little promise. As a teenager, she was described as bold, rebellious, and fiercely independent. She wasn't content with a quiet life in her small town. Mirtha had big dreams and was willing to take risks to achieve them. This adventurous spirit would later drive her into the dangerous world of drug trafficking. Like many Cubans during the post-revolution years, Mirtha eventually left her homeland in search of a better future. She is believed to have moved to Colombia in her late teens or early 20s. It was in Colombia, then becoming a major hub for the global drug trade, that her life would change forever. She quickly found herself immersed in a world of money, power, and danger. In Colombia, Mirtha connected with people tied to the emerging cocaine trade. The Medellín Cartel was gaining power, and Mirtha's charm and quick wit allowed her to move seamlessly within these circles. It was a world dominated by men, but Mirtha's beauty and intelligence gave her an edge. She attended high society parties where deals were made, money flowed freely, and cocaine was as common as champagne. But this glamorous lifestyle came with a price: exposure to drugs, addiction, and constant danger. She was no stranger to risk, and her reputation as a resourceful and daring woman made her a valuable asset. It was this reputation that eventually led her to Miami and into the arms of George Young. Now, if you don't know who Boston George Young is, then you don't know anything about cocaine. Boston George was a notorious drug trafficker and smuggler who played a key role in the U.S. drug trade during the 1970s and 1980s. He was a primary figure in the Medellín Cartel, working closely with Carlos Lehder and Pablo Escobar to smuggle massive quantities of cocaine into the United States. When Mirtha arrived in Miami in the mid-1970s, the city was undergoing a dramatic transformation. Once a sleepy vacation town, Miami had become the epicenter of the booming cocaine trade. By the time she stepped onto the scene, it wasn't just a city. It was a playground for drug lords, traffickers, and cartel associates, and Mirtha fit right in. It was at one of Miami's infamous parties that Mirtha first met Boston George, who was already a successful drug smuggler. Their chemistry was immediate and undeniable. George, known for his charisma and ambition, was captivated by Mirtha's fiery personality and her deep ties to the Colombian drug world. For Mirtha, George represented power and adventure, a perfect match for her own daring spirit. In the movie Blow, Mirtha was engaged to an associate of Carlos Lehder. Around the same time, George and Mirtha started their steamy affair. In reality, Mirtha dated many drug traffickers, but her being engaged to one was not the truth at all. Mirtha was a free spirit who enjoyed having multiple partners. She loved the fact she could have control over the drug traffickers she was sleeping with. But Boston George was different. Mirtha truly fell in love. The two quickly became inseparable, blending their lives and their business. George had the connections to bring massive amounts of cocaine into the U.S. with the help of Carlos Lehder, And Mirtha, with her charm and cartel connections, made sure the operation ran smoothly. Together, they created a life of unimaginable wealth, partying in luxury hotels, flying on private jets, and living like royalty. Remember the fellow we mentioned earlier, Carlos Lehder? Well, it turns out he had a very pivotal part in this whole story. You see, without Carlos Lehder, this story would never be as important as it is. In the movie Blow, the character Diego is based on Carlos Lehder. The partnership between Carlos and Boston George was instrumental in the development of the drug trade in the 1970s, but their relationship was marked by ambition, manipulation, and an eventual falling out. Carlos and George first met in the mid-1970s, while both were serving prison sentences at Danbury Federal Correctional Institution in Connecticut. At the time, George was already an experienced marijuana smuggler, having pioneered a system of using small planes to transport large shipments of marijuana from Mexico to the U.S. Carlos, though relatively new to drug trafficking, was eager to break into the cocaine trade. He had grown up in Colombia, where the cocaine industry was burgeoning, and saw its potential as far more lucrative than marijuana. While in prison, Carlos and George formed a bond and exchanged ideas. Carlos introduced George to the cocaine trade.
What do you know about cocaine?
Describing it as the next big thing. Together, they smuggled massive quantities of cocaine, fueling the early days of the American cocaine epidemic. Over time, their partnership began to sour due to increasing ambition and ego. Carlos viewed himself as a revolutionary figure in the drug trade, obsessed with power and control, and began cutting George out of key operations. After being cut off by Carlos, George continued smuggling cocaine independently, but lacked the protection and resources of the Medellín Cartel. So he decided to join forces with the only man that could help and protect him at the same time. You guessed it, the king of cocaine himself, Pablo Escobar. Mirtha and George lived what many would call a dream life. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming. Their world revolved around cocaine, not just selling it, but using it. Mirtha, who had been introduced to drugs at a young age in Colombia, developed a severe addiction. Her substance abuse began to take a toll on her health and her relationship with George. By the early 1980s, the U.S. government had ramped up its war on drugs, and George and Mirtha's empire was crumbling. Cartel associates began turning on one another, and law enforcement agencies were closing in on major players in the cocaine trade. In 1984, George was arrested after being betrayed by one of his associates. Mirtha, facing legal trouble of her own, made the difficult decision to cooperate with authorities. Her testimony against George ensured a lighter sentence for herself, but it also destroyed the marriage, leaving George to serve 20 years in prison. While George was in prison, he received a visit from Mirtha. She came bearing a message from Pablo Escobar, insisting that George should cooperate with the U.S. authorities against his former business partner, Carlos Lehder. Escobar recognized that Carlos Lehder's loud, brash demeanor had become a liability. By allowing George to cooperate with authorities, Escobar could distance himself and the cartel from Carlos Lehder's actions. Following Escobar's advice, George testified against Carlos in court, providing critical information that helped convict him in the U.S. Carlos was extradited in 1987 and sentenced to life in prison plus 135 years, though his sentence was later reduced after he also cooperated with U.S. authorities. Around this same time, Mirtha went to see George in prison, but this would be the last time she ever did. Mirtha told George that she wanted a divorce and that she did not want anything to do with him or the drug business anymore. The only problem was Mirtha still had a drug problem of her own that would last decades. After serving 10 years in prison, George was released in 1994. However, this did not last long. He was arrested again that same year, attempting to distribute 800 kilos of cocaine. This time, the U.S. government had enough. Boston George was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Perhaps the greatest tragedy of George and Mirtha's story was the impact it had on their daughter, Christina. Christina was just a child when her father was arrested and sent to prison. With Mirtha battling addiction and trying to escape the drug world, Christina was largely raised by George's parents. The absence of both her mother and father created a deep sense of abandonment that would shape her life. Despite the pain and distance, Mirtha's greatest hope was for Christina to build a life free from the shadows of her parents' mistakes. Though their relationship was strained, Mirtha reportedly tried to support Christina in her adult years. However, much like her own life, Mirtha chose to remain private, leaving Christina to navigate her story largely on her own. In the years after his release, George gained some fame following the release of Blow in 2001, which chronicled his life and his relationship with Mirtha. The movie reignited public interest in their story, but it also reopened old wounds for those closest to him. While George embraced the notoriety and even gave interviews about his life, Mirtha and Christina largely stayed silent, choosing not to engage with the media. Boston George Young passed away in 2021, leaving behind a complicated legacy. For all his charm and ambition, his choices had cost him his family and, ultimately, his freedom. His love for Mirtha and Christina remained a central theme in his life, but it was a love that could never fully be repaired. As for Mirtha, her story remains shrouded in mystery. After leaving the drug trade and working to overcome her addiction, she disappeared from the public eye. Unlike George, who embraced the spotlight, Mirtha chose a life of quiet reflection. She was a woman who loved fiercely, made mistakes, and ultimately chose to walk away from the life that nearly destroyed her. Well, that's it for this episode. What are your thoughts about the real Mirtha Jung? Let us know in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more untold stories that only Health Wealth Diary can bring you. See you next time.